I'm being looked at and watched, so I think it's time to start. Oh, it's a gorgeous morning out today. It's a blessing to be here. We're in Leviticus chapter 21. Last week we talked about some of the special requirements or rules, maybe I should say, about priests. We talked about how they were at times restricted on how they could approach and who they could approach as far as going to funerals or helping prepare or whatever, because they would be made unclean by that. And so for a regular priest, it was limited to their very immediate family. And we talked about the high priest and how his rules were even more specific, in fact that he could not even leave the sanctuary in case of a funeral or something like that. He was not allowed to, because he was just not allowed the possibility even of him being unclean and therefore causing the temple to be unclean. We talked about how that blemished priests that had deformities or blemishes, were not allowed to offer sacrifices, that they had to be clean. They also could not, be missing an arm, broken arm, whatever. They could not be blemished. We talked about after that, even though a priest was not allowed to give sacrifices, or maybe I should rephrase that, perform the sacrifice. Even though they were not allowed to perform the sacrifices, they were allowed to eat of the food. And I think we see a picture of God saying, I'm taking care of you. You're going to be taken care of. The rules are not here to punish you as much as they are to take care of you. And he talks about who is allowed to eat the food that is offered, that is given to the priest. That was where they got their meats and their breads from. And so it's interesting to look at, to me, because it's showing how that, okay, if something needs to be done, well, we're going to do it. We're going to find a way to do it. And it was like, okay, let's say if your daughter, a priest's daughter, marries outside the priesthood, they weren't allowed to eat of the food from his household, but they had some way to provide it because they were outside. But if her husband died or she came back to live with her father, she could eat that food. So a lot of reasonableness going on here. And we also talked about just as, in essence, very similar to the blemishes that priests could not have, the sacrifices could not have. They could not offer blemished sacrifices. They had to be spotless. We went over that. So we're down toward Leviticus chapter 21 and looking at, my clicker's being stubborn. Looking at the last of chapter 22, starting in verse about 26. And we get to a section that it almost seems out of place. We're seeing where they changed, and some commentators and people have said, well, this is kind of environmentalism, taking care of them. It doesn't make a lot of sense that way to me. But let's look at it and think about it and see how this fits to a certain degree. Verse 26, and Jehovah spake unto Moses, saying, when a bullock or a sheep or a goat is brought forth, then it shall be 7 days under the dam. And from the 8th day and thenceforth it shall be accepted for an oblation of an offering made by fire to Jehovah. I wanted to read that in a different version. Let me jump over to the one I was going to read. It's a little bit easier. Verse 26, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, concerning a calf or a sheep or a goat, whenever it may be born, then it must be 7 days under its mother. But on the 8th day and henceforth it shall be acceptable as a gift by fire to the Lord. Why? Why did they have to wait until the 8th day to be able to offer an animal? And after reading a lot of commentaries and this type of thing, I finally came to a conclusion that was not very often stated, and yet it makes a lot of sense to me. So take it for what it's worth. And that is the fact that there is a level of compassion, a level of understanding that we're all supposed to have. And if we are calloused, even to, excuse the expression, dumb animals, we can bring that into our lives with people, I'm afraid. And so I kind of think that's part of what's going on here. God is telling the children of Israel, you have to have at least a minimal amount of compassion, even for these animals that I've given you to offer sacrifices for. And when you think of the animal world, and we think of pets, and if you've ever lived on a farm, worked a farm maybe I should say, and I really haven't, then you do get a little callous toward the cows. I mean, my wife describes cows as dumb, and they really are. They're pretty dumb. But, then you turn around and you see the 4-H'ers that are raising cattle and their whole purpose for raising them is just auction them off. And they're crying when they do. We do need to have at least a little bit of sympathy and understanding with creation. I think there's a big thing about creation. Yes, sir. Yes.
Especially
I hadn't thought of that. Very good.
Time, when someone's raising like a pig or something for slaughter and it's like in the house and when the kids name it, they give it like the name pork chop or something, Then once that pig is ready to go get slaughtered, the whole family is just like devastated when that happens. And so it adds more value to the sacrifice.
I hadn't thought of that exact thing. That's very good. And I think that there is something there that we have to catch on to. And it goes on, verse 28, and a young bull or a sheep and its young you shall not slay on the same day. Now, what difference would that make to the ones you're slaying? I think it has more to do with us or them than it has to do with the cattle itself. And that's just something we need. We need to be able to feel. And I didn't think about it until just now, so I haven't looked up the verses. But there are passages that talk about being unable to cry or to be unable to be ashamed or to blush, that type of thing. We need to be able to do that. We need to have the knowledge, the understanding, and the compassion. As far as health, as far as scientifically, I guess there are some psychological effects on the animals because animals do. The internet can be a terrible thing and it can be a wonderful thing. I love watching videos where cats get chickens and kind of nurse them. Cuddle. You see these animals that are introduced as they have given birth to other babies and they just take them in. And so, there is some physical or mental aspect to the animal, but I still believe that the majority of the reason for this is for us, not necessarily for the animals. It's for us to realize that we need to be compassionate. We need to have some understanding and value of what's going on. Verse 29. But whenever you offer, I wanted to change versions on this one. I'm going back to the ASV. And when you sacrifice the sacrifice of thanksgiving unto Jehovah, ye shall sacrifice it that it may be accepted, or in a way that will be accepted. On the same day it shall be eaten. Ye shall leave none of it to the morning. I am Jehovah. And this is going back to the rules of the offerings we gave earlier. And he's reiterating here that, okay, you want to do it. You want to offer the sacrifices. You want to slaughter the animals as you're supposed to. You're supposed to have compassion. But you're still supposed to do what I've said. And that is, on this type of sacrifice, you're supposed to eat it the same day, within a day type thing, and not have any left over, and you're not supposed to eat it after. And why is that important? Because God said do it that way. And it's like, okay, when we don't do what God says, we are, and what does it say after this? Therefore ye shall keep my commandments and do them. I am Jehovah. Ye shall not profane my holy name. If they didn't do what God told them, this was the result. You profane my holy name, but I will be hallowed, or some versions say sanctified. I will be set apart. I will be special among the children of Israel. I am Jehovah, who halloweth or sanctifieth you. I'm the ones that makes you special. Who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am Jehovah. As we talk about these passages like this, it always comes back to me. He's saying, okay, look, you saw me bring you out of Egypt. You saw what I did to take care of you. You know that I promised Abraham. I'm keeping my promise. I am Jehovah. And there's something in that just almost makes me just tingle when I read that. We get into chapter 23, and we're looking at the feast or festivals. What's the difference between a feast and a festival to us?
Feast is a gathering of people who spend that with their loved ones, and a festival is just a gathering of people who party.
We think a feast is food. And as that was part of it, I think that's part of the reason for the translation feast. But I think in actuality, as you read this, it talks about a holy convocation or a sacred assembly, depending on your version. The concept is more of the festival, not necessarily sometimes joyous, but a gathering more than just a feast. And this is just personally Daryl. When I think of feast, I think sitting down to a big table, and that's not what these were about. That was part of it, but it wasn't what they were about. So when it says feast, realize that we're talking a little bit different language here. Excuse me. And Jehovah spake to Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, The set feast of Jehovah, which ye shall proclaim to be holy convocations, even these are my set feast. Convocations is a word I looked up. I wasn't sure what it meant. And these say sacred assemblies, different versions. The concept is a special gathering. And it's talking about the children of Israel. But one of the definitions for convocation that I thought was very interesting was reading. Reading. So I get kind of from some of these that there's an emphasis on God's word in part of this. Don't know how accurate that is, but that was something that I picked up. And we get into something we've talked about before in verse 3. And this is something that seems like every time I study it, I learn a little bit more. Verse 3, 6 days shall work be done, but on the seventh day is the Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. Ye shall do no manner of work. It is a Sabbath unto Jehovah in all your dwellings. What does the word Sabbath mean? Seven? Saturday?
Well, that's Saturday.
Seventh Saturday? What? Last day of the week? We think about Sabbath a lot, but the actual meaning of the word Sabbath is a transliteration. It's not translated, it's a transliteration. It's the Hebrew word transposed into English. And it literally means to cease. And some dictionaries go to the extreme to say that the double B in Sabbath, which of course they don't have B's in Hebrew, but whatever. But they say that that's an emphasis. And it means to utterly cease. And when you think of creation, that's kind of what we see. And we think of Sabbath along with creation because on the seventh day God rested, and that's a bad thing in my mind because we don't think of God resting. We think of him as resting, but we should think of him, he stopped. That's the import there. Okay, with that background, let's think about the children of Israel. What was their life like in Egypt? They were in slavery. What? Ceaseless. That's a good point. What we know, we don't know specifically a lot of details about their slavery. But we do know that they were, at times, there were things done that the sole purpose was to oppress them, to push them down, to hold them down. Think about being told to throw your babies in the Nile. There's no reason for that than other to oppress them. That was part of their slavery. When Moses came back and started talking to Pharaoh, what happened to the children of Israel?
They didn't get straw.
They were oppressed more. They were made to work more. Now, I want you to think about something. Here are these people. They have seen what God has done in Egypt. They have seen what God did as they were leaving Egypt. I mean, this was not a story to them. This was something that happened to them. And then God says, I don't want you to do any work on a day. How much of an impact do you think that had on them? I hadn't thought about that until I was studying for this class. How much of an impact do you think that had on somebody that was forced to labor, made their labor made harder, and now all of a sudden they said, no, there's a day I don't want you to do any work. You think they rejoiced in that? It would be, yeah. Do you think they expected it? I don't. I think that it was a big, this is special. And then you read the commentaries, and by the time of Jesus, one said there were over 400 rules about how to keep the Sabbath. It was no longer a joyous thing. It was a trouble. And we can associate that because sometime in our lives we have thought about, I got to go to church Sunday. Yes, sir.
Let him go first and then I'll ask.
Okay.
I just said it for a question. Am I to understand a holy
Convocation.
conversation? Is that the same as a worship?
I don't know. It says a solemn assembly or a sacred assembly or some other translations. I didn't see anything that said it specifically worship, but we do know that the Sabbaths were supposed to be dedicated to the Lord.
The reason I asked that, in verse number 3, it says, the Sabbath, the day of rest, but it also mentioned is a day of holy time.
Right. So it's kind of, yeah, I'm not positive to answer that question. Yes, sir.
So my question to you, and this is like probably lack of information on my side, do we know and how do we know that they did not work on the Sabbath as slaves?
Oh, as slaves, they did. Before they left Egypt. There is no reason for us to think that they did not slave every day. There may have been times for the gods of Egypt where they were not allowed to. We don't know about that, or at least I don't. But as they came out, God says, okay, on the Sabbath, you're not going to do any work. That was one of the things. That's part of it. But my point was simply, okay, how important was that? And then turn around and what did it turn into for them? But a pain, a struggle. And we need to be careful about that. That was my point. Yes, sir.
It became a point of oppression.
Yes. Hadn't thought of that either. You're doing good with it today. So you know, that's the point I was wanting to get across here. Now, the next thing, why did God give the Sabbath? Okay.
So I had mentioned that I believe that the Sabbath was the day of reckoning for the Lord, to keep it holy, to praise the creation that he created, to admire it, to enjoy that fruit that he provided for us.
I won't disagree with that. But this to me is exciting. I'm going down a rabbit hole. I'm sorry. But while I was studying for this, I found a verse. You know, there's something, when you read the Bible, it's more than we think, but it seems like there's not a lot of times that God says, this is why. You know, it's like when he's talking about elders, he says if they, you know, the reason they have to do this is because if they can't control their own house, how are they going to control the house of God? You know, so that's a why. And when he says why, I always say we need to really pay attention to that. Now, he says why a lot more than I think. But when I see that, it causes these little red flags to go up and pay attention. So, let me get the verse. Turn over to Ezekiel chapter 20. Ezekiel chapter 20. Now, I wanted to read this whole passage, but I'm not going to for lack of time. So go back and read it. It's in essence talking about how the children of Israel didn't do what God said to do. Okay, and it repeats that a lot. But in Ezekiel chapter 20, in verse 12, it reads as follows. Moreover, also, I gave them my Sabbaths, to be a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am Jehovah that sanctifies them. He told us why. Now, what does that make you think of today for us? What has he given us?
First day of the week.
First day of the week.
Specifically gathering with the other believers on the first day.
Gathering with the other believers on the first day. I think of this, the communion. He has given us something so that we realize he is the one that sanctifies us. He is the one that cleanses us. I mean, think about this. It's almost chilling when you think about the correlations there. But he said, I gave it to them as a sign between me and them, so they would know that I have sanctified them. That's powerful. The Sabbath is a very special thing to the children of Israel. Now, there's some people that want to continue the Sabbath today. What we have from the New Testament is the example that the people gathered together on the first day of the week, not the Sabbath. But the concept of thinking about creation, the concept about thinking about God, is something we need to be careful not to lose. We need to remember who God is, what He has done, and the respect that that deserves. And so, like I said, every once in a while I go down these rabbit holes while I'm studying, and I don't really mean to do it in class, but I feel like it's important that I bring these out sometimes. So, okay, so let's go back and talk about the feast. So he starts off by saying, okay, we have these Sabbaths. Now, here's another rabbit hole I went down. We think of Sabbaths as always being on Saturday or the Sabbath, starting at Friday at 6 p.m. as far as the Jewish calendar goes. Okay, we're going to see all these where he says, well, this is going to be a holy Sabbath. And I thought, did it always fall on Saturday? And after a lot of searching, and I don't know. I will tell you what I found out. The Hebrew calendar is very interesting. If you do a search on the internet again and ask tell me about the Hebrew calendar, it will show you the Hebrew holy days, the Hebrew special days, whatever you want to call them, on our calendar. And a lot of times it will show the Sabbath on Friday. Well, it's starting Friday afternoon because their day starts at essentially sundown or 6 p.m. The Hebrews in the time of the wanderings in the desert didn't have this calendar. They did a moon calendar. Their months are 29 or 30 days long. Now, we have one that's 28 and a bunch that are 31. Their calendar runs 29 to 30 days long for each month. And I did a search once again, and guess how long a lunar cycle is? 29 and a half days. They actually started the first of the month. Now, think back to when we started in Leviticus. We talked about how Jehovah said, this is the first of your year. This is the first day of this month. They started their months the first day they could see a crescent moon after the new moon. That's what I was able to find out. It later changed to a mathematical assumption of when the first moon comes, because some days there's clouds and you can't see it. So, and then as time has progressed, it's come to be overlaid on the Gregorian calendar, or the calendar we use. Well, it gets more complicated, because back in this time, the Egyptians, the Canaanites, these people around them, their years started in the fall. And so as we go through here, we're going to see that the 7th month is a very special month. The first month correlates to, and I'm going to make sure I get this right, let me look at my notes, correlates to April-ish, March, April timeframe. Well, let's back up a second. You see, what happens is they have their calendar. They have 12 months of 29 or 30 days, and that adds up to 354 days. How many days are in a year? Son, 365. So that leaves 11 extra days. And a quarter. So that leaves 11 extra days. So what did they do? Every 3 years, they added an additional month. Now, what does that do to their festivals? It moves them around a little bit. It changes. So when you look in our calendar, it may be March that they have Passover one year and April the next because of the way the calendar shifts. So, there's a lot of interesting things like this. But so as we read these, don't get too confused at it. So we start off in verse 4 or 5. Let's go to 5. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, at even, is Jehovah's Passover. Now, what did the Passover represent?
Passover is when they mark the door with blood, so that way.
The doorpost and the lintel with blood, and that evening the messenger of God passed over and killed all the firstborn. That is, and in Egypt. Yeah, this was when that started. That's what they're remembering with that. And as you read some of the other descriptions in the Bible, it says they do it specifically so that when their children say, what's going on? They would tell them. Once again, we have a really good way of relating to that. So we have the Passover. The Passover was 1 day long. Immediately after the Passover, verse 6, and on the 15th day of the same month is the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. Now, what did the unleavened bread have to do here?
The bread of haste.
Okay, the bread of haste. They left. They didn't take leaven with them. They didn't have leaven in the wilderness. And so they have a feast for 7 days where they eat unleavened bread. They weren't even allowed to have it in their houses. And it was to remind them, oh, guess what? God took us out of Egypt. Okay, so it goes on to say, excuse me, 7 days shall ye eat unleavened bread, and the first day ye shall have a holy convocation or a sacred assembly. Ye shall do no servile work, but ye shall offer an offering made by fire to Jehovah 7 days, and the seventh day is a holy convocation, and ye shall do no servile work. Verse 9, and Jehovah spake to the Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel, and say unto them, when you are come into the land which I will give you, which I give unto you, and shall reap the harvest thereof, ye shall bring the sheaf of the first fruits to the harvest unto the priest, and he shall wave the sheaf before Jehovah. Now there is some confusion and some disagreement among people about when this actually is. I tend to fall with it being on the 16th of the first month, and I'll tell you why in a few minutes. However, knowing Hebrew literature, it's quite possible that this is not linear here, and this is talking about the feast that comes back at the end of the Feast of Harvest. I think it's not. I think this is the first harvest. When I first thought of it, I thought of winter wheat growing up in Alabama. Well, it wasn't really winter wheat there. It was more like barley. But the first harvest would start coming in about this time in their first month, April time frame. So they would bring a sheaf of their first harvest, normally of barley, to be weighed. Now, if you skip down to verse 15, it says, and ye shall count unto you from the morrow after the Sabbath, from the day ye brought the sheaf of the wave offering. And I believe that's talking back up to what we just read. So what I see here is that we see they have the Passover. They have the Feast of the Unleavened Bread starting the next day, but it lasts 7 days. And on the next day after that starts, or on the 16th, they have this first fruits offering. Now, if that's the case, when did they harvest this first fruit? At least the day before the Passover, because they would not be harvesting it on the Passover or the day after. So that's kind of the way you would have to tie that together for that to be there. Now, it talks about this, and it goes on, even the morrow after the seventh Sabbath, you shall offer the number 50s. This is most often called by older texts the Feast of Weeks, because it's 7 weeks, 7 Sabbaths after the Passover. In the time of Jesus, that term, the term that came to be most commonly used was Pentecost, because that meant 50th. 7 times 7, 49, and the next day 50th. So we get some confusion in there. We're talking about the Feast of Weeks or Pentecost, and this is what happens when that happens. What was Pentecost to the Jews? Do you remember? That was considered the Feast of Weeks, and harvest was part of it. But it was also, when you think about, okay, this is getting a little interesting. We have the 10th day of the month, the 14th day of the month, the 14th day of the month is the Passover. And then we have 7 weeks. How long was it till Jubilee? We have another group of 7 years, 49 years. All of this seems to be very symbolic in here. And I think God is trying to get across to them, this is continuing. This is something that is not just today, it's a continuous thing. You need to remember these things. You need to remember that I am Jehovah who sanctifies you. Now, with this one, it talks about you bring special offerings, and you read all this, and then you skip down to verse 22, and this is why I agree with the fact that it has something to do with harvest, because in verse 22 it says, and when you reap the harvest of your land, and it goes on to talk about you don't glean all the edges. This is a reiteration of you leave some for the poor, for the sojourners. And so I see that Pentecost there, that session there, and a lot of commentators made the comment that this was kind of the conclusion or the end of the Passover. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know.
I believe you're talking about Shabbat.
Yes, that is.
And yeah, it was right after Passover on the 50th,
Yeah.
the feast of the 50s.
Yes. Yeah, Feast of Weeks, yes.
And from what I recall, it was a remembrance of the Torah being handed to the Israelites,
And a lot of commentators build on that and say that it was a day where they read the Torah.
Yes.
So we're seeing a lot of holy assemblies. Is that a good word to use here? Special times when they're saying, hey, we need to pay attention to God. We need to remember who God is, what God has done for us. That's something we can't get away from today. Okay, verse 23. And Jehovah spake to Moses, saying, speak unto the children of Israel, in the 7th month, on the 1st day of the month, shall be a solemn rest unto you. I don't know if that was a Saturday or not. Shall be a solemn rest unto you, a memorial of blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. And ye shall do no servile work, and ye shall offer an offering made by fire unto Jehovah. This first day of the 7th month was the first day of the civil year. And it actually came to be known today as Rosh Hashanah. I think I said that right, Rosh Hashanah. And it is the first day of the year. Now, we just read that the first day, 7 months ago, was the first of their year. So what's the only way we can tie this together is that the 7th month was the civil year, even though the Jewish rule, the Jewish kingdom, was a combination of religious and civil. The areas around them had a civil calendar, and that was the first of their year. Now, interestingly enough, we won't go read it, Ezekiel 40 and verse 1 is the only time in Hebrew that the word Rosh Hashanah is in the Bible. At least that's what I read. And that is specifically talking not about the first of the Hebrew year, but the first of the Babylonian year. So just for what it's worth there, remember when they're talking about the first year, even now, when the Hebrews, the Jews, talk about Rosh Hashanah, they're talking about the first of the year. But the first of the year was 7 months before. So it can get very confusing. But it ties back when you think civil versus religious and in these feasts. And what does blowing of the trumpets remind you of? That was the first thing I thought of, and I didn't see a single commentary that talked about it. But that was the first thing. But it was a triumphant thing. And after study, I got to thinking about it kind of like our fireworks. It's a celebration. It's a big thing. And to take how the Jews took it for a long time and still take it today, it's like, okay, the first of the new year, we're going to take the next 10 days and think about the awe of God. How awesome all God is. Think about repentance. And then on the 10th day of the month, verse 26, and Jehovah spake to Moses, saying, howbeit, on the 10th day of the month is the Day of Atonement. So it's kind of like they've stacked these 10 days as one holiday or one remembrance or one worship service. I think somebody said one. The idea here, although it's not necessarily said that way, it seems like that's what they're doing now. And we see, we've talked about the importance of the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement was one day of celebration. Now, if we skip down to verse 34, speak to the children of Israel and say, on the 15th day of the 7th month, so we have the first day, the 10th day, now the 15th day of the 7th month, is the Feast of Tabernacles for the 7 days unto Jehovah. A lot of versions say the Feast of Booths. And it specifically says, I think here, I've read so much I get confused about where things are sometimes, that part of the reason for that is because they wanted God wanted them to remember that He brought them out of Egypt and made them live in booths or in tents and took care of them. Tents, booths, little booths, tents. Booth. It's this southern accent. Booths, tents, tabernacles, little houses. And the important there is God had them live in these tents and took care of them. And if you read about it, it talks about some of the things that they will do when they make these. Look at verse 39. Howbeit on the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered in the fruits, this is the end of the harvest, okay? When you have gathered in the fruits of the land, you shall keep the feast unto Jehovah 7 days. So we have another 7-day feast here, starting on the 15th. On the first day shall be a solemn rest, and on the 8th day shall be a solemn rest. And ye shall take on you the first day of the fruit of the goodly trees, branches of palm trees, and boughs of thick trees and willows of brook, and ye shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. Now, there are several passages We won't go into them right now, that talk about how they did things and whatnot. But history tells us that they used the trees with the bigger branches, and after they went into the land, they would go up on the top of their houses and build tents or small houses, booths, out of the bigger branches. And the men would carry around the fragrant branches that were smaller, that weren't fit for building something to stay in like that, and wave them around. And it reminds me a lot of what we think of as Palm Sunday in the New Testament. But that's the concept there, and it's very interesting, because if you remember, what were they saying when Jesus came into Jerusalem?
Hosanna.
Hosanna. What does Hosanna mean?
Save us now.
Save us, we pray. And that's what this is picturing, that type of a concept. And so we see these feasts, these festivals, that go on the first month and really on the seventh month, pushed out through the days. And then, of course, and one of the things I forgot to mention, a lot of people in past years, I don't know about today, took the first day of the seventh month, the Feast of Trumpets. They took that first day as saying, this is a Sabbath representing the whole seventh month. And so it was kind of this is special. It included the Day of Atonement, harvest, the first fruits, just all these things. And it was just so special to them. And I go back and I think, okay, special back like we started in Sabbath with, oh, this is special. And how it later became to be a trial to them.
I hope they could write all this stuff down. How in the world they remember all this?
Well, part of it, I honestly believe, is because most of them couldn't read and write. And not being able to read and write, they spent a lot more time memorizing and thinking. I don't know about you, but in these modern ages of computers, when I can look up anything I want, I don't remember half the stuff. I have to look it up. How many of you remember other people's phone numbers, really, you know? No, we got to just punch it and go. I think that's part of it. I think they remembered more because they had to. And then, of course, it was written down too, and they kept it. They may not have kept it right, but they kept it.
Yeah, plus Moses reminded them, because God always says, speak to the children of Israel.
How often? Yeah, speak to the children of Israel and tell them. You know, it's okay. So one last thing I want to think about. Our time is past, but we've talked about these feasts, these festivals. There's one last feast that's not mentioned here. That's actually not talked about in the Old Testament that much, really. That's very, very important to us. And that's mentioned in Revelation chapter 19 and verse 9. And that's the marriage feast of Christ and the church. Tie that back to these and you think, oh, wow. To me, this is one of the themes that ties the whole Bible, that helps us to understand how inspired, how, even though written by multiple men, was controlled by God. Thank you for your attention and your comments today. We'll go into chapter 24 next week. We're almost at the end. You're almost done with me.